Welcome to Play Me to Sleep. Tonight, we are going to tell the story of a man who owned almost nothing, held no political office, commanded no army, and wrote not a single word. A man who was, by every conventional measure of his time, completely unremarkable. And yet, 2,500 years after his death, his name is still spoken in universities and courtrooms and quiet rooms where people sit and wonder how they ought to live. His name was Socrates, a stonecutter's son from Athens, who asked questions so dangerous that the most celebrated democracy in the ancient world decided the only solution was to kill him. We will walk with him through the sun-baked marketplace where he spent his days, barefoot and relentless, dismantling the certainties of generals and politicians and poets who were absolutely sure of themselves right up until the moment they met him. We will sit beside him as he faces trial before 500 of his fellow citizens on charges that could have been answered with a simple apology and were not. We will stand in that small prison cell on the last evening of his life, where his friends wept openly and he spoke with total calm about the soul and what might come after death. And we will ask the question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How did one barefoot man with no money and no power change the entire course of human thought? This is not a simple story of a hero and his enemies. It is stranger and more interesting than that. The city that killed Socrates was also the city that produced him, the same restless, brilliant, self-questioning Athens that invented democracy and tragedy and historical writing and the very idea of open debate. He was its greatest product and its most uncomfortable truth. He held up a mirror to a civilization at the height of its confidence, and what the mirror showed was not what the civilization wanted to see. That is a story as old as wisdom itself, and it is one that has never stopped being relevant. So settle in, let the noise of the day fall away. Let us travel back to the city of marble and olive trees, to the agora where ideas could get you killed, to Athens in the age of its glory and its shame. Let us go and find the most fascinating, the most maddening, the most consequential man who ever went barefoot through history. To understand Socrates, you need to understand Athens in the 5th century BC, because it was one of the most extraordinary places that human civilization has ever produced. In a relatively short span of time, this single city generated ideas, art forms, and modes of inquiry that would shape the entire subsequent history of the Western world. It was the place where democracy was invented, where tragedy and comedy were developed as theatrical forms, where historians first tried to write accounts of the past based on evidence rather than legend, and where philosophers first began asking questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and the good life with the kind of systematic rigor that still defines intellectual inquiry today. But Athens was also a deeply contradictory place. It was a democracy that owned slaves, at times numbering in the tens of thousands, who had absolutely no say in its celebrated political life. It was a city that celebrated reason and yet kept a vast array of gods, consulted oracles, and persecuted those whose religious beliefs departed from accepted norms. It was a community that valued free speech and open debate, and yet would, before the century was out, execute its most famous philosopher for the crime of asking too many questions. The Athens that produced Socrates also destroyed him, and understanding both sides of that equation is essential. Socrates was born around 470 BC, though the exact date is uncertain, as is so much about the early life of a man who never wrote a single word himself. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonemason or sculptor, depending on which ancient source you consult. His mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife. Later in life, Socrates would draw on both of these parental occupations as metaphors for his own philosophical practice, describing himself as a kind of spiritual sculptor who shaped the minds of the young, and comparing his method of bringing out ideas through questioning to the art of midwifery, helping people give birth to thoughts that were already gestating inside them. The Athens of Socrates' childhood was a city emerging from a period of existential crisis and emerging triumphant. The Persian Wars, in which the vastly outnumbered Greeks had somehow repelled two massive invasions from the largest empire the world had yet seen, had ended only a decade or so before his birth. The victory at Marathon in 490 BC, where the Athenians fought largely alone against the Persian force, had already entered legend. The sea battle at Salamis in 480 BC, where the Greek fleet had shattered the Persian navy in the straits between the island and the mainland, was still vivid in the memories of the oldest citizens. Athens had distinguished itself in these conflicts, and the civic pride that flowed from the Persian Wars shaped everything that followed. In the years after the wars, Athens entered a period of extraordinary prosperity and cultural confidence that historians have come to call the Golden Age. Under the leadership of the statesman Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics for much of the second half of the 5th century, the city embarked on an ambitious program of building and artistic patronage. The Parthenon was constructed, the Erechtheion was built. The great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, were writing their plays. The historian Herodotus was gathering material for his account of the Persian Wars. Athens was rich, powerful, and brimming with creative energy, and it knew it. It was into this atmosphere of confidence and inquiry that Socrates grew up. He received the standard Athenian education of his day, which meant learning to read and write, studying music, and training the body through gymnastics. He was exposed to the ideas of the philosophers who had preceded him, particularly the pre-Socratics, those remarkable thinkers from the Greek cities of Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, who had first tried to explain the natural world without reference to the gods. Thales had proposed that water was the fundamental substance of all things. Anaximander had proposed a boundless, indefinite substance as the underlying reality. Heraclitus had argued that the fundamental nature of reality was change itself. Parmenides had insisted, paradoxically, that change was an illusion and that true reality was one, unchanging and eternal. The young Socrates was apparently fascinated by all of this. He spent time, according to later accounts, with a philosopher named Archelaus, who was a student of Anaxagoras, one of the most sophisticated of the natural philosophers. But at some point, Socrates became dissatisfied with the enterprise of explaining the physical world. He found he was more interested in questions that should not be answered by looking at rocks or rivers or the movement of the stars. He wanted to know how human beings should live, what made an action just or unjust, what courage really was, what friendship meant, what beauty was. These were questions the natural philosophers had largely ignored, and Socrates decided, somewhere in his early adulthood, that they mattered more than anything else. Athens was also a city of extraordinary intellectual density. In the decades surrounding Socrates' birth and early life, the same streets that he would later make his philosophical classroom hosted some of the most remarkable minds the ancient world had ever produced. The playwright Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon, was writing the Oresteia. Pindar was composing his victory odes for the great athletic games. The sculptor Phidias was beginning work on the colossal statue of Athena that would stand inside the Parthenon, made of ivory and gold and visible from miles away. Pericles was reorganizing the empire and reshaping the city's political institutions. It was a world in which excellence in almost any field was publicly celebrated, rigorously competed for, and taken with complete seriousness. Socrates grew up breathing this air, and it shaped him in ways that are difficult to separate from who he was. His family's circumstances placed him at an interesting social position. He was not poor in the sense of being destitute, but he was not wealthy by the standards of the Athenian elite. His father's trade as a craftsman gave the family a modest but respectable standing. Socrates later received the small inheritance that allowed him to avoid having to work for money throughout most of his adult life, devoting his time instead to philosophy. But he lived simply, dressed simply, and never accumulated the kind of wealth that would have given him formal political influence or placed him in the highest social circles. He existed, in a sense, between the worlds, comfortable enough with everyone that no class distinction felt impenetrable, poor enough in material terms that he had no stake in the system of wealth and power that his questions so frequently unsettled. Before Socrates became famous for his words, he was notable for his endurance. Athens in the 5th century required military service from its male citizens, and Socrates served, by all accounts, with considerable distinction. He fought in at least 3 campaigns during the long and grinding Peloponnesian War, the conflict between Athens and Sparta that dominated the second half of the century, and ultimately ended with Athens's defeat. The first campaign was the siege of Potidæa, a city in the north of Greece that had revolted against Athenian control. The siege lasted from roughly 432 to 429 BC, 3 years of brutal and uncomfortable work in the cold northern climate. Socrates was already in his late 30s or early 40s by this point, well past the age at which most men might expect to be doing front-line service. He is said to have marched barefoot through the snow, a detail that struck his fellow soldiers as remarkable to the point of the supernatural, and to have shown no signs of distress that others could detect. He also, according to accounts preserved in Plato's dialogues, saved the life of a young man named Alcibiades in combat, pulling him from danger with total disregard for his own safety. Alcibiades would become one of the most fascinating and problematic figures in Athenian history, a man of dazzling gifts and catastrophic judgment, and his relationship with Socrates would become one of the most analyzed personal connections in all of ancient literature. But at Potidæa, he was simply a promising young man from a good family who who would have died without the intervention of this barefoot philosopher. The second campaign was at Delium in 424 BC, where the Athenians suffered a significant defeat against the Boeotians, allies of Sparta. In the retreat that followed, a disorganized and dangerous affair, Socrates was observed walking calmly through the chaos, his expression unchanged, his bearing entirely composed. The general Laches, who was present, later described the scene to Plato in terms that suggest he had never quite gotten over it. He said that if the Athenians had fought like Socrates, the battle might have gone very differently. The third campaign was at Amphipolis around 422 BC, another difficult engagement in the northern theatre of the war. By this point, Socrates was approaching 50, an age at which most Athenian men had long since concluded their active military careers. But there is no account of him seeking to avoid service, complaining about the conditions, or behaving in any way differently from how he behaved at home in Athens. This physical toughness was not incidental to who Socrates was. It was of a piece with his philosophical stance. He consistently argued that the pleasures and comforts of the body were of far less importance than the condition of the soul, and he lived this position absolutely. He ate simply. He drank moderately. Though he was apparently capable of consuming very large quantities of wine without becoming visibly drunk, a fact noted with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment by his companions. He wore the same rough cloak winter and summer. He owned almost nothing. He rejected the idea that wealth, status, or physical comfort were genuine goods worth pursuing. These were not performances. They were expressions of a coherent and deeply considered view of what a human life ought to be. Back in Athens, between campaigns, Socrates lived in the way that would make him famous. He haunted the agora, the great marketplace at the center of the city, engaging anyone who was willing in conversation. He visited the workshops of craftsmen and the gymnasiums where the young men exercised. He attended the same festivals and dramatic performances as everyone else. He participated in the religious life of the city with apparent sincerity. And everywhere he went, he asked questions. What made Socrates unique was not that he had answers. It was that he was supremely, deliberately, almost aggressively interested in other people's answers, and in the process of taking those answers seriously enough to examine them properly. This approach, which later came to be called the Socratic method, or elenchus, was both intellectually devastating and personally infuriating for anyone on the receiving end of it. The method worked like this. Socrates would approach someone who was considered knowledgeable or distinguished in some field. He might approach a general and ask what courage was, or a judge and ask what justice meant, or a poet and ask about beauty. He would begin by appearing genuinely humble, almost deferential, claiming to know nothing himself and expressing great eagerness to learn from this obviously wise and experienced person. This was, his more perceptive interlocutors eventually realized, not entirely sincere. But it was not simple pretense either. It reflected something genuine in Socrates' self-understanding, which was that he was deeply aware of the limits of his own knowledge. The person would then offer a definition. Courage is standing firm in battle, a general might say, and Socrates would nod thoughtfully and then ask a clarifying question. just one small question. Surely, he might suggest, a diver who descends into unknown waters shows a kind of courage, even though he is not standing firm but moving forward. Is that courage? Yes, the general would agree. That seems courageous too. And what about the person who persists in an enterprise that others have warned them is genuinely dangerous and probably foolish? Is that courage, or is that something else, something more like recklessness? And so it would go, question following question, each one seemingly innocent, each one quietly unraveling the thread of the previous answer, until the general, who had commanded armies and faced death in battle, found himself unable to say with any confidence what courage actually was. The experience, as described by those who underwent it, was humiliating and illuminating in equal measure. Socrates called it aporia, a state of productive puzzlement, a recognition that you did not know what you thought you knew. He argued that this state was actually the beginning of genuine wisdom, that you could not start to think clearly about something while you were still convinced you already understood it. The unexamined life, he famously declared, was not worth living, but the process of examining it was not painless. He did this to generals, to politicians, to poets, to craftsmen, to wealthy men of leisure, to young aristocrats who thought their breeding gave them wisdom, to sophists who charged large fees for teaching the art of argument. He did it to Anytus, a prosperous tanner who would later become one of his accusers. He did it to Meletus, a minor poet who would eventually bring the indictment against him. He did it to Euthyphro, a man absolutely convinced of his own religious expertise. He did it, apparently, to anyone who would engage with him, and a surprising number of people did, because whatever else the experience was, it was never boring. The effect on Athens was complex. A significant portion of the city's young men were absolutely captivated. They followed Socrates around, observed his conversations, tried to replicate his questioning technique with varying levels of success, and considered him the most interesting person they had ever encountered. Some of them, like Plato and Xenophon, would preserve his memory in writing that has survived for 2.5 millennia. Others, like Alcibiades, absorbed his ideas imperfectly and applied them in ways that had very little to do with the search for wisdom. But another significant portion of Athens was less enchanted. The people who had been publicly shown not to know what they thought they knew did not, as a rule, respond with gratitude. They felt humiliated. They felt exposed. They felt with some justification that this short, ugly, barefoot man had made them look foolish in front of witnesses. And over the decades, a slow accumulation of resentment built up around Socrates in the city, like sediment depositing on the bed of a river. It did not make itself felt immediately, but it was there, patient and gathering. There was a specific category of person whom Socrates seems to have found particularly interesting and particularly difficult to deal with: the sophist. The sophists were professional teachers of wisdom and rhetoric who charged fees for their instruction, often very substantial fees, and who attracted wealthy young men eager to learn the arts of persuasion and argument that would serve them in law courts and political assemblies. Some of them were genuinely brilliant. Protagoras, perhaps the most famous, had developed a sophisticated philosophy centered on the famous claim that man is the measure of all things, meaning that truth and value are relative to the individual perceiver. Gorgias was a dazzling rhetorician whose demonstrations of persuasive technique drew audiences from across the Greek world. These men were successful, admired, and well compensated. Socrates' relationship with the sophists was complicated. He shared their interest in argument and their belief that examining ideas was important. But he differed from them on the most fundamental possible point. The sophists taught people how to win arguments. Socrates was interested in finding out whether the positions being argued for were actually true. The distinction sounds simple, but it is enormous. Winning an argument and arriving at the truth are not the same thing, and can in fact be completely opposed. A skilled rhetorician can make a false position seem plausible and a true position seem doubtful. Socrates regarded this skill, divorced from any commitment to truth, as not merely useless, but positively dangerous, a kind of flattery of the mind that produced the appearance of wisdom without the substance. He also refused to charge fees for his conversations, a practice that set him apart from the sophists in a way that was noticed and appreciated by some Athenians and resented by others. He insisted that he had nothing to teach, that he possessed no wisdom to transmit, and that therefore the idea of being paid for his company made no sense. This was partly genuine and partly tactical. Genuine because he truly believed that understanding could not be handed over, but had to be worked out through dialogue. Tactical because by refusing payment he could not be accused of selling something he did not possess, which was the charge he most frequently leveled at the sophists themselves. One of the most intriguing and genuinely strange aspects of Socrates was something he called his daimonion, which translates roughly as his divine sign or divine voice. He described it as an inner signal, not a voice exactly in the sense of audible speech, but something like an intuition or an internal check that would intervene to prevent him from doing something when he was about to make a wrong choice. It never told him what to do, he said. It only prevented him from doing certain things. It was, in essence, a veto, not an instruction. He was entirely serious about this. He mentioned it in his defense speech at his trial. He discussed it with his friends throughout his life. He did not present it as a metaphor or a poetic way of describing his conscience. He seemed to understand it as a genuine experience, a real signal that he received, one that he trusted completely and that he believed set him apart in some small but significant way. Whether we interpret this through a religious lens, as a literal divine communication, or through a more psychological one, as a description of unusually clear moral intuition, it clearly played a central role in how Socrates navigated his life. There is also the matter of the oracle at Delphi, which became one of the defining episodes of Socrates' self-understanding. The oracle at Delphi was one of the most important religious institutions in the Greek world. People came from across the Mediterranean to put questions to the priestess who was said to speak with the voice of the god Apollo. Her responses, famously ambiguous, were interpreted by priests and carried home by petitioners who spent months or years trying to understand what the god had meant. At some point, Probably in the 430s BC, a friend of Socrates named Chaerephon visited Delphi and asked the oracle whether any man was wiser than Socrates. The oracle replied that no one was wiser. When Socrates heard this, he was apparently baffled and not in a comfortable way. He knew that he was not wise in any ordinary sense. He was not an expert in war or medicine or shipbuilding or statecraft. He had no special technical knowledge. He was simply a man who went around asking questions and finding that he could not answer them satisfactorily. How could someone like that be the wisest person in the world? His response to this puzzle was characteristically Socratic. He decided to investigate. He went around Athens finding people who were widely considered wise: the poets, the politicians, the craftsmen, the teachers of wisdom, and he questioned them carefully. What he found was that none of them actually knew what they claimed to know. The politicians had impressive opinions, but could not defend them when pressed. The poets wrote beautiful things, but could not explain what those beautiful things meant or why they were valuable. The craftsmen were genuinely expert in their crafts, but they had mistaken their technical skill for wisdom about deeper matters and were therefore, if anything, worse off than people who knew nothing at all. From this investigation, Socrates drew a conclusion that would shape the rest of his life. He was wiser than other people, he decided, in one small but crucial respect. He knew that he did not know. Other people did not know, but they thought they did, which meant they were operating under a double disadvantage, being ignorant and being unaware of their ignorance. Socrates, at least, was aware of his ignorance, and this awareness, this recognition of the limits of one's own knowledge, was, he believed, the necessary beginning of all genuine wisdom. Socrates never founded a school in any formal sense. He had no fixed premises, no curriculum, no fees, no enrollment process. He simply lived his life in public and attracted people who found that life impossible to ignore. The conversations that resulted were preserved, imperfectly and selectively, by the men who remembered them, and the picture that emerges is of something between a philosophical seminar and an ongoing drama conducted in workshops and wrestling grounds and private dining rooms across the city of Athens. Among his companions, the most significant for history was Plato, who was born around 428 BC, some 40 years after Socrates, and who encountered him as a young man, probably in his early 20s. Plato came from an aristocratic Athenian family with connections to the city's political elite, and by his own later account, he had considered pursuing a political career before his encounter with Socrates redirected him entirely. The effect of knowing Socrates was, for Plato, something like conversion. He abandoned his political ambitions, spent years traveling and studying after Socrates' death, and eventually founded the Academy, the institution often considered the first university in the Western world, which operated for nearly 900 years. Almost everything we know about Socrates comes through Plato's dialogues, which means we are always seeing Socrates through a lens that is also, inevitably, Plato. Xenophon was another important source. He was a soldier and historian, less philosophically sophisticated than Plato, but perhaps for that very reason more useful as a witness to the texture of Socrates' everyday presence. His accounts of Socrates are less dramatic and intellectually dazzling than Plato's, but they have their own value as portraits of a man navigating ordinary life. Xenophon's Socrates is someone who gives practical advice, who talks sensibly about household management and military strategy, who is valued by the people around him as a thoughtful and decent companion, as well as an intellectual provocateur. There was also Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, who wrote a play called The Clouds, in which Socrates appeared as a figure of ridicule, running a school called the Thinkery, where young men learn to make the weaker argument appear stronger and to evade their obligations to their families. Aristophanes' Socrates is fascinated by the natural world, spending his time investigating the movements of the moon and the composition of the air, which was actually more characteristic of the pre-Socratic philosophers than of the historical Socrates. But the play tells us something important all the same. It tells us that by the 420s BC, Socrates was prominent enough to be worth satirizing, recognizable enough to require no introduction, and associated clearly in the Athenian public mind with intellectual sophistry and dangerous influence over the young. Among the young men who gathered around Socrates, the most brilliant and the most troubling was Alcibiades. He was extraordinarily handsome, from an ancient and wealthy family, with a charm that was described by contemporaries as almost irresistible. He was also reckless, ambitious, and possessed of a moral flexibility that made him one of the most controversial figures of his era. He loved Socrates deeply and told him so in terms that are preserved in Plato's Symposium, one of the most moving and psychologically acute passages in ancient literature. But he was unable or unwilling to live by the philosophical standards that Socrates embodied. He became a demagogue, then a traitor who defected to Sparta, then a refugee who negotiated his way back to Athens, then a general, then an exile again. He was eventually assassinated in Phrygia, abandoned by the city he had served brilliantly and betrayed spectacularly. Socrates' connection to Alcibiades was one of the things held against him at his trial. If this was what the great teacher produced, the implicit argument ran, then the teaching itself must be corrupting something. The accusation was not entirely fair, because Socrates had clearly tried to redirect Alcibiades toward virtue and had failed. But in the aftermath of a devastating war that had left Athens humiliated and reduced, the desire to find someone to blame was powerful, and Socrates, with his associations with a man who had done so much damage, was a convenient focus. One of the most striking aspects of the philosophical tradition that Socrates founded is how seriously it took the subject of love. For Socrates, eros, the Greek concept of love and desire, was not a distraction from philosophical inquiry, but potentially one of its most powerful engines. The longing that draws a person toward what is beautiful was, he argued, not so different from the longing that drives the philosopher toward wisdom. Both are forms of desire for something felt to be more perfect, more complete, more real than what everyday experience ordinarily provides. The most extended and beautiful treatment of this idea comes in Plato's Symposium, a dialogue set at a dinner party given by the poet Agathon to celebrate his victory in a dramatic competition. The assembled guests, including Aristophanes, Alcibiades, and various others, agree to take turns offering speeches in praise of Eros, the god of love. Each speech is characteristically different from the others, reflecting the different personalities and preoccupations of its author. But it is the speech attributed to Socrates, and through him to a mysterious figure called Diotima of Mantinea, a woman described as a priestess and philosophical teacher, that has attracted the most sustained attention across the centuries. Diotima, speaking through Socrates, describes love as a ladder or a staircase. The ascent begins with the physical beauty of a particular person, which draws one upward. From this, the lover is led to recognize that the beauty in one beautiful body is related to the beauty in other beautiful bodies, and from there to recognize beauty in souls, in activities, in institutions, in forms of knowledge. At the summit of this ascent is beauty itself, the form or idea of beauty, which is not beautiful in the way that a face or a body or a poem is beautiful, but is the source and standard of all beauty everywhere. To glimpse this, Diotima says, is the closest a human being can come to genuine fulfillment. Whether or not Diotima was a real historical person, and scholars have debated this for centuries, the speech attributed to her through Socrates represents one of the most influential philosophical accounts of desire, love, and transcendence ever written. It gave the Western philosophical tradition a framework for understanding the relationship between physical attraction and spiritual aspiration that echoes through Neoplatonism, through Christian mysticism, through the poetry of Dante and Petrarch, into the modern period. The symposium also gives us the remarkable scene in which Alcibiades arrives late, drunk, and wearing a garland of ivy, and delivers a speech not in praise of Eros, but in praise of Socrates himself. It is a startling and affecting passage. Alcibiades compares Socrates to the figure of Silenus, a grotesque-looking creature from mythology whose exterior conceals statues of the gods inside. He describes Socrates' effect on him in terms of shame and pain and longing and inadequacy, saying that only when he is with Socrates does he feel that the way he is living his life is indefensible, and that only by staying away from Socrates can he avoid confronting this feeling. He is, in other words, describing the experience of conscience, rendered with almost unbearable psychological honesty. The Athens of Socrates' middle and later years was not the Athens of his youth. The long catastrophe of the Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BC and ground on for nearly 3 decades, slowly transformed the city's mood. Athens had entered the war as the dominant naval power in the Greek world, confident in its resources, its allies, and its leadership. It would emerge from it defeated, its empire dissolved, its walls pulled down, its democracy temporarily replaced by an oligarchic junta. The turning point was the Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BC, one of the most catastrophic military ventures in ancient history. Alcibiades had been one of the architects of this plan, a bold attempt to extend Athenian power westward by conquering the island of Sicily, and in particular its wealthy city of Syracuse. On the eve of the fleet's departure, the Hermes, stone pillars topped with the head of the god Hermes that stood throughout Athens, were mutilated in a single night. The city was horrified and terrified by this sacrilege. Alcibiades was accused of involvement, and though he denied it, the charges followed him and eventually contributed to his decision to defect to Sparta rather than face trial. the Sicilian expedition ended in complete disaster. The Athenian forces, tens of thousands of men, were annihilated. Those who survived the battles were worked to death in the stone quarries of Syracuse. The city received the news in stunned disbelief. It was the kind of catastrophe from which a normal society might not recover, and Athens nearly did not. In the years that followed, as the war ground toward its conclusion, Athens experienced something close to political collapse. In 411 BC, the democracy was temporarily overthrown by a group of oligarchs who established what was called the 400. The democracy was restored, but the trauma of the coup left lasting scars. In 404 BC, Athens finally surrendered to Sparta, and a new oligarchic regime, backed by Spartan power, was installed. This group, 30 men who governed with extreme brutality, became known as the 30 Tyrants, and their brief reign of terror, lasting less than a year, claimed the lives of around 1,500 people. Socrates was in Athens throughout all of this. He was in the city when the news of Sicily arrived. He was there during the oligarchic coup. He was there under the 30 tyrants when the streets of Athens were not safe and people were disappearing. During the regime of the 30, he was actually ordered to participate in the arrest of a man named Leon of Salamis, almost certainly as a way of making him complicit in their crimes. Socrates simply refused and went home. He later described this refusal as unremarkable, the only possible response for a man who cared about justice. But men were being killed for less, and the fact that he survived this particular act of defiance had probably more to do with luck and with the imminent collapse of the 30 than with any mercy on their part. The democracy was eventually restored in 403 BC, and a general amnesty was declared, forbidding Athenians from prosecuting one another for actions taken during the years of conflict. Athens was trying to rebuild itself, to seal over the wounds that the war and the coups had opened. It was a city in recovery, politically exhausted and searching for stability. It was into this fraught atmosphere that the trial of Socrates arrived 3 years later, in 399 BC. The charges. The formal charges against Socrates were read out in the Athenian agora and recorded for posterity. They were two. First, that Socrates was guilty of impiety, specifically of failing to acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledged and of introducing new divine beings. Second, that he was guilty of corrupting the youth. These charges were brought by 3 men: Meletus, the nominal lead prosecutor, a minor poet with no particular political connections; Anytus, a prosperous businessman and democratic politician who had played a role in overthrowing the 30; and Lycon, an orator of whom relatively little is known. The real animating force behind the prosecution was almost certainly Anytus. The impiety charge was the more serious in a formal sense, but it was also the more complicated. Athens had a long tradition of prosecuting those who offended the gods, but what counted as impiety was genuinely ambiguous. The charge of introducing new divine beings almost certainly referred to Socrates' daimonion, his inner voice, which he had spoken about publicly throughout his life. The charge of failing to acknowledge the city's gods was harder to substantiate because Socrates had visibly participated in Athenian religious life. He sacrificed, he prayed, He attended festivals. He had served in the army under the standard Athenian invocations of divine protection. Whatever exactly he thought about the nature of the gods, he was not an obvious public atheist. The corruption of the youth charge was more viscerally compelling to an Athenian jury. They could point to Alcibiades, who had spent years around Socrates and had gone on to cause enormous damage to the city. They could point to Critias, one of the most brutal of the 30 tyrants, who had also had connections to Socrates' circle. The fact that Socrates had not invented Alcibiades' recklessness or Critias' cruelty was, from the perspective of an aggrieved jury, rather beside the point. He had spent decades telling young men that the authorities did not know what they claimed to know, that accepted wisdom deserved to be questioned, that the unexamined life was not worth living. From a certain angle, this looked a great deal like teaching the young to despise their elders, their institutions, and their traditions. There was also a dimension to the trial that the formal charges did not quite capture. Athens in 399 BC was still raw with grief and anger over the war, over the oligarchic coups, over the suffering of the past few decades. The amnesty of 403 BC had legally prevented anyone from prosecuting others for what had happened during those years, but it could not prevent people from feeling what they felt. Socrates had not been one of the 30. He had refused to participate in their crimes. But his association with men who had caused enormous harm, combined with his lifelong habit of making important Athenians feel stupid, had created a reservoir of ill will that the amnesty could not touch and the trial could legitimately express. The trial of Socrates took place before a jury of 500 Athenian male citizens chosen by lot from the city's eligible voters. This was the standard Athenian practice for serious cases. There was no judge in the modern sense. The jury both decided guilt and determined the penalty. The proceedings took place in a single day, which was also standard. Each side had a fixed amount of time measured by a water clock, a clepsydra, and when the water ran out, the speaker's time was done. What Socrates said in his own defense is preserved in a form that is almost certainly shaped by Plato's artistry, if not invented wholesale, in the dialogue called the Apology, a word that in Greek simply means defense speech rather than apology in the modern sense. It is one of the most remarkable texts that antiquity has left us, a document that manages simultaneously to be a great piece of rhetoric and an almost suicidal refusal to use rhetoric in the way the occasion demanded. Athenian juries expected defendants to be contrite. They expected appeals to pity. They expected the defendant to bring his weeping wife and children into court, to show the jury what his execution would mean for those who depended on him. They expected, in short, a performance of appropriate humility and regret. Socrates delivered none of this. Instead, he offered something far more provocative, a calm, methodical defense of everything he had done, combined with a refusal to acknowledge that any of it had been wrong. He began by addressing the jurors directly and noting that he was going to speak plainly, without rhetorical ornamentation, because plain speech was what the truth required, and because he was, after all, 70 years old and had been speaking plainly his entire life. He then addressed not just the formal charges before the court, but the whole background of resentment and misunderstanding that had accumulated around him. He acknowledged that many Athenians regarded him with suspicion, that the comedy of Aristophanes had done him particular damage, and that he had a reputation he had never quite managed to shake, despite the fact that it bore little relation to what he actually did or believed. He described the oracle at Delphi and his subsequent investigation of the city's supposed experts, an account that must have been particularly unwelcome to any of those experts who happened to be on the jury, and he explained that he had understood his questioning as a service to the god, a continuation of the investigation the oracle had initiated. He had been, he said, like a gadfly sent to sting the city into wakefulness, and without him the city would simply go back to sleep in its comfortable ignorance. This was not, as several scholars have noted, the most tactful image to deploy before a jury whose votes you were trying to win. He refused to propose a penalty of exile or a heavy fine that might have satisfied the jury and saved his life. When the jury found him guilty, by a relatively narrow margin by Athenian standards, and called on him to propose a counter-penalty to the prosecution's demand for death, he initially suggested, with a defiance that infuriated many jurors, that the appropriate penalty for a man who had spent his life serving Athens was to be housed and fed at public expense for the rest of his days, an honor reserved for Olympic victors and great benefactors of the city. He eventually settled on a modest fine, paid by his friends, but the damage was done. The second vote, on penalty, went against him by a larger margin than the first. The jury had decided that he was guilty but had been willing to let him live. His own behavior in the second phase of the trial made them decide otherwise. The jury found him guilty by a vote of 280 to 220, which, by the standards of Athenian mass verdicts, was relatively close. Had 30 more jurors voted the other way, he would have walked free. This narrowness has interested historians ever since, because it suggests that Athens was genuinely divided about him, that the prosecution, despite all the resentments that had accumulated over the decades, was not able to carry the city entirely. A meaningful number of his fellow citizens, more than 2 in 5, were willing to acquit him even in the charged atmosphere of 399 BC. What followed the verdict was a delay that was unusual and deeply significant. Athens was observing a period of religious purity at the time of the trial, during which executions were traditionally suspended until the return of a sacred ship that had sailed to the island of Delos to honor Apollo. This meant that between the verdict and the execution, a period of approximately 30 days elapsed, during which Socrates remained in prison, visited daily by his friends, continuing to talk and to think. During this period, a plan was arranged for his escape. One of his wealthy friends, Crito, came to the prison with the proposal already organized. The guards had been bribed. The arrangements were in place. Crito urged Socrates to leave, pointing out that he had the resources to live comfortably in exile, that remaining in prison was unnecessary, and that his death would leave his children without a father and his friends without a teacher. The argument was practical, emotional, and entirely reasonable. Socrates refused. The dialogue Plato wrote to record this conversation is called the Crito, and it is one of the most important texts in the history of political philosophy. Socrates' refusal was not based on indifference to his own life or to the feelings of the people who loved him. It was based on a careful argument about the relationship between a citizen and the laws of his city. He had lived in Athens for 70 years. He had accepted the benefits of its laws, its education, its protections. He had had ample opportunity to leave and had never chosen to. By remaining, he had entered into an implicit agreement with the city, an agreement that bound him to accept its decisions even when those decisions were wrong. To escape now, however unjust the verdict might be, would be to break that agreement. It would be to place his own comfort above the principle that the law should be respected. This argument has fascinated and troubled philosophers ever since. It has been read as the origin of social contract theory, as an anticipation of civil disobedience debates, as evidence of Socrates' genuine conservatism, and as the most extreme possible illustration of his fundamental commitment to consistency between words and actions. Whatever else one thinks of it, it is not the argument of a man who was indifferent to ideas. It is the argument of a man who had thought with extraordinary care about what he believed and was not prepared to abandon those beliefs when they became inconvenient. The conversations continued in the prison through those final weeks. Plato's dialogue Phaedo, which purports to record the events and discussions of Socrates' last day, is one of the great literary achievements of ancient Greece. Whether it accurately reports what was actually said is impossible to know, but it captures something that the people who were present clearly felt, that Socrates faced his death differently from how most people face it, with a quality of attention and equanimity that those who watched found both moving and deeply strange. On the final day, his friends gathered in the prison cell. They were weeping. Socrates was not. He talked at length about the soul, about what reasons there might be for believing that death was not the end, about the possibility that the soul might be immortal and might continue in some form that he could not fully describe, but could approach through argument. He was careful to say that he did not know these things with certainty, but he had lived his life in pursuit of wisdom and goodness, and whatever awaited him, he did not think a good man needed to fear it very much. At sunset, the prison officer came with the cup of hemlock. The poison had been prepared. Socrates was given the option of delaying until later in the evening, but he declined. His friends wept. He told them gently that dying was not a thing to be dramatized. He had prepared himself, he said, throughout his entire adult life for the possibility of this moment by trying to live as well as he knew how to live. What more preparation could there be? He drank the cup. He walked around the cell for a time, as he had been instructed, until his legs felt heavy. He lay down. The numbness crept upward. His last recorded words, spoken when he was very nearly gone, were addressed to Crito. He asked him to remember that they owed a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing. It was a small debt, a ritual obligation, the kind of thing a careful man would not want to leave unpaid. Crito said that he would see to it. And then Socrates was still. The hemlock itself deserves a brief consideration, because it is one of the most discussed poisons in history. Hemlock, The plant Conium maculatum contains a series of alkaloids that paralyze the muscles progressively from the extremities inward toward the trunk, while leaving the mind clear. This is precisely what the ancient sources describe. Socrates walks, feels his legs grow heavy, lies down. The numbness creeps upward, and he remains mentally alert and conversant until very near the end. Modern pharmacologists have noted that this description is consistent with what we know of hemlock poisoning, though some details in the account suggest it may have been administered as part of a mixture. Whatever the precise chemistry, the accounts agree on the essential quality of the death. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely lucid, which was, in its way, perfectly suited to the man undergoing it. The prison where Socrates spent his final weeks is thought to have been located near the southwest corner of the Agora. Archaeologists have identified a building in this area that may correspond to the ancient sources, and within it excavated a number of small terracotta medicine bottles that might have contained the doses of hemlock administered to condemned prisoners. These physical traces, a few ceramic fragments in the Athenian soil, are almost all that remains as direct material evidence of the most famous execution in the history of philosophy. The rest is text and memory, and the long, loud echo of consequence. Socrates left no writings. Not a single word that he put down himself has survived, because he never put any words down. He wrote nothing, kept no records, composed no treatises. This was not an oversight. He seems to have had considered reasons for his refusal to write, rooted in his belief that genuine philosophical understanding could only emerge through live dialogue, through the back and forth of question and answer, through the specific and irreplaceable human encounter between one mind and another. Writing, he argued, gives only the appearance of wisdom because a text cannot respond when questioned. It cannot adapt to the reader. It is a dead record of living thought, and dead records mislead more often than they illuminate. The irony, of course, is that Socrates is one of the most written about figures in the entire history of human thought, and everything that has been written about him is, by definition, written by someone else. We have the dialogues of Plato, the memoirs and dialogues of Xenophon, the hostile portrait in Aristophanes, a few fragments from other authors who wrote about him in antiquity, and that is essentially all. Every subsequent attempt to understand who Socrates was and what he thought has had to navigate this strange paradox. The man who valued dialogue above all else is accessible to us only through documents, the very medium he distrusted. What those documents agree on is remarkable enough. They agree that Socrates was physically distinctive, short and stocky, with wide-set eyes and a flat nose, and a face that contemporaries described as resembling a satyr, one of the grotesque, half-human figures of Greek mythology. They agree that he was personally magnetic in a way that went beyond physical appearance, that people who spent time with him found the experience difficult to forget and even more difficult to fully articulate. They agree that he was absolutely consistent between his public teaching and his private life, that he did not preach one thing and practice another, and that this consistency was rare enough to be remarked upon as something very nearly miraculous. The philosophical legacy is immeasurable in scope. Plato took the Socratic commitment to examining fundamental questions and built upon it an entire system of metaphysics, ethics, political philosophy, and epistemology that shaped the intellectual history of the next 2,000 years. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, took that legacy and reoriented it in directions of his own, and between them, Plato and Aristotle defined the agenda of Western philosophy for most of its subsequent history. The various Hellenistic philosophical schools that emerged after them, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, all understood themselves to be working through problems that Socrates had first identified and framed. Beyond philosophy proper, the influence spreads in every direction. The idea that human beings have a natural capacity for reason and a natural orientation toward the good, and that this capacity and orientation are what define our humanity, runs through Stoic ethics, through Roman political thought, through Christian theology, through the natural law tradition, through Enlightenment thinking about human dignity and rights. The idea that wisdom begins with acknowledging one's own ignorance has recurred in every intellectual tradition that has grappled seriously with the limits of knowledge, from the Islamic philosophical tradition to the European scientific revolution. The idea that genuine education is not about transmitting information, but about helping people think more clearly for themselves has inspired educational reformers from antiquity to the present. The Stoic philosophers, who flourished in the generations after Plato and Aristotle, took the Socratic idea of virtue as the only genuine good and built an entire ethical system around it. The Stoics, from Zeno of Citium through Chrysippus and eventually to the Roman thinkers Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, argued that everything external to the mind, wealth, health, reputation, physical pleasure, was in the final analysis indifferent, and that the only thing truly within our control, and therefore the only genuine basis of happiness, was the rational, virtuous exercise of the will. This was Socratic in its bones. It was also a philosophy that proved remarkably portable, surviving the collapse of the Greek world, the rise of Rome, and the eventual Christianization of the empire to re-emerge in the Renaissance, and again in the modern period, as a resource for people trying to navigate uncertainty and loss with some measure of dignity. The Cynics, a school associated with Diogenes of Sinope, took a different but equally Socratic direction. They pushed the idea that virtue was the only good to its logical extreme and concluded that all social conventions, all claims of status and wealth and respectability, were simply obstacles to genuine virtue and should be abandoned entirely. Diogenes famously lived in a barrel in the marketplace, owned literally nothing, and insulted kings and philosophers with equal cheerfulness. When Alexander the Great visited him and asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes is said to have replied that he could step out of his sunlight. There is something recognizably Socratic in this: the bare feet, the contempt for comfort, the delight in puncturing pretension, though pushed to an extreme that Socrates himself would probably have found excessive. The Phaedo gives us 4 arguments for the immortality of the soul, each one presented by Socrates, and each one then examined and challenged by his interlocutors in the genuinely Socratic spirit of testing ideas rather than simply asserting them. The first argument draws on the idea of opposites, suggesting that just as sleep gives rise to waking and waking to sleep, death gives rise to life and life to death, in a cycle that implies the continuing existence of the soul between incarnations. The second argument invokes the theory of recollection, the idea that learning is really a form of remembering, which implies that the soul existed before birth with knowledge it brings into the world and recovers through education. The third and fourth arguments engage with the relationship between the soul and the forms, the eternal, unchanging realities that Plato had made central to his philosophy. Whether one accepts these arguments or not, their presence in the Phaedo tells us something important about how Socrates faced death. He did not face it with the simple bravery of a soldier who charges forward without thinking. He faced it with the careful, examined confidence of a man who had spent his life trying to understand what mattered and had arrived at a provisional but genuine conviction that the soul's well-being was more important than the body's survival. He was not performing courage. He was living, on the last day of his life, the conclusions he had been working toward for decades. The consistency was the point. It was, in a sense, the final demonstration of everything he had ever tried to teach. There is also a deeply personal dimension to Socrates' legacy that tends to get overshadowed by the grand philosophical sweep. He was, by all accounts, a deeply loyal friend. The men who gathered around him were not simply students collecting intellectual capital. They were people who loved him, in some cases with an intensity that speaks to something about his presence that philosophy alone does not quite capture. Plato was not in the prison on the last day because he was ill, he tells us, and the way he records this small fact suggests it haunted him for the rest of his life. Crito had been his friend since childhood. Phaedo, in whose name the dialogue of the last day was recorded, wept and then laughed and then wept again, unable to settle into either grief or composure. These were not the reactions of people who had lost a teacher. They were the reactions of people who had lost the person around whom their understanding of what mattered had organized itself. The question of what Socrates actually believed, as opposed to what Plato put into his mouth, is one that has occupied scholars for the entirety of the period since his death. There is a scholarly tradition that tries to distinguish the earlier Platonic dialogues, where Socrates tends to ask questions and reach negative conclusions, from the later ones, where he propounds elaborate positive theories about the forms and the soul and the ideal city. The argument is that the earlier dialogues give us something closer to the historical Socrates, while the later ones represent Plato using his teacher's name and persona as a vehicle for his own increasingly ambitious philosophical system. This distinction, while plausible, is ultimately impossible to verify and may itself be misleading. The Socrates of the early dialogues is already shaped by Plato's intelligence and art. There is no unmediated access to the man. What we can say with some confidence is that the historical Socrates cared above all about one question: how should a human being live? Not how should a city be organized, though that followed. Not what is the ultimate nature of reality, though that was connected. Not what are the gods, and what do they want, though that was never far away. The central, driving, inexhaustible question was the personal and ethical one. Given that we are alive, given that we have some capacity to choose how we spend our time and what we value and how we treat the people around us. What should we actually do? What does a good human life look like? Not in the abstract, but in the specific, daily, irreversible choices that a person makes from the moment of waking to the moment of sleep. This question has the quality of the genuinely philosophical, which is to say, it cannot be answered once and put away. It must be revisited as circumstances change, as the people around you change, as you yourself change, through the accumulation of experience and loss and understanding. And it must be answered not just in words, but in action, which is why Socrates' consistency between his philosophical positions and his lived choices mattered so much to those who knew him. He was not merely describing how a good person should live, he was attempting, imperfectly but genuinely, to be one. The attempt was the teaching. There is a moment in Plato's Republic, one of his later and most ambitious dialogues, where Socrates describes what he calls the allegory of the cave. It is one of the most famous philosophical images ever constructed. He asks us to imagine people chained in an underground cave facing the wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, figures carry objects whose shadows are cast onto the wall in front of the prisoners. These shadows, which the prisoners have been watching all their lives, are the only reality they know. They have given names to the shadows. They have developed expertise in predicting the sequence in which the shadows appear. They are, by any standard that their situation allows, extremely knowledgeable about the shadows. Now imagine, Socrates says, that one prisoner is freed and turned around. The firelight blinds him. The actual objects, more solid and complex than their shadows, confuse him. He wants to turn back to the familiar wall, but he is dragged upward out of the cave into the daylight. At first, the sunlight is unbearable. Gradually, he can look at reflections in water, then at the objects themselves, then, finally, at the sun directly. He understands now that the sun is the source of all light, all growth, all visibility, all truth. And then he is taken back down into the cave to share what he has learned with those who are still chained there. They think he has gone mad. They cannot see what he describes. And if he persists in trying to persuade them that the shadows are not the whole of reality, they will eventually, Socrates says quietly, try to kill him. The allegory is Plato's, in the sense that he wrote it and shaped it into the philosophical system he was building. But the experience it describes, the discomfort of being released from comfortable certainty into blinding, painful clarity, the isolation of someone who sees differently from those around them, the danger that awaits anyone who returns to the cave to challenge the prisoner's assumptions, that is profoundly Socratic. It is a portrait of what Socrates did every day in the agora, and the fate of the philosopher who returns to the cave, that is also his. Plato wrote the allegory after Socrates was dead, but in writing it he was describing the man he had watched live and the death he had been too sick to witness. Every word of it is shaped by grief and by the determination that grief should produce something lasting. In the end, what is most remarkable about Socrates is not that he had answers. Very few of the conversations recorded in Plato's dialogues end with a definitive conclusion. The interlocutor has been shown that his initial confident position cannot be sustained, but a satisfying replacement has not always been found. This has sometimes troubled readers who want philosophy to deliver results, to produce doctrines and propositions that can be written down and carried home and used to guide life. Socrates rarely delivers this. What he delivers instead is something simultaneously simpler and harder. He delivers the experience of genuine inquiry. He demonstrates that the most important questions about what makes a life good, what justice requires, what we owe to one another, what we owe to our city, what courage and wisdom and beauty really are, cannot be answered once and then set aside. They must be returned to again and again in different circumstances and from different angles by every person who takes their own life seriously. Philosophy, for Socrates, was not a subject that one studied and completed. It was a way of living, a practice of constant self-examination, an ongoing conversation that ended only with death. He was also, in a way that tends to get lost in more abstract treatments of his legacy, deeply funny. The Socratic dialogues are full of moments of gentle irony, of pointed observation, of a humor that is never mean, but is often very sharp. He understood perfectly well that there was something comic about a short, barefoot, snub-nosed man who owned almost nothing going around Athens, demolishing the self-assurance of its most distinguished citizens. He seemed to take a certain quiet pleasure in the spectacle. This playfulness was inseparable from the seriousness. It was part of what made him so difficult to dismiss and so difficult to forget. The city of Athens eventually decided that it could not afford him. Too much had happened, too many wounds had opened, too many people had been embarrassed or bereaved or simply exhausted by his relentless questions. The charges against him were not entirely fabricated. His associations with men who had done great damage to the city were real. His habit of undermining confidence in authority was real. His inner voice, his daimonion, was genuinely unorthodox in a city that took its religious life very seriously. There were people who sincerely believed that he was corrupting the young, not through malice, but because his example encouraged a kind of critical independence that they found dangerous. And yet, the verdict of history has been unambiguous. Within a generation of his death, Athens regretted it. The story spread quickly that the Athenians had soon come to feel the shame of what they had done, and that several of the men who had been involved in the prosecution suffered social disgrace. Whether these accounts are accurate in every detail matters less than what they reveal about how people came to understand the event. Athens had killed its most interesting citizen for the crime of being too interesting. It had punished a man for asking questions by silencing him forever. And the questions he had asked did not go away. They became louder. 2,500 years later, they are still asking to be answered. What is justice? How should a human being live? What do we owe to one another and to the communities that shape us? When should we defer to authority, and when should we resist? What does it mean to know something, really know it, rather than simply believing it? These are not questions that have grown old or been superseded. They are as urgent as they have ever been, perhaps more so in an age that has so many confident opinions and so little patience for the kind of sustained, uncomfortable examination that Socrates practiced. He walked barefoot through the marketplace of Athens and asked questions that the city did not want to answer. He was tried, convicted, and executed for it. He drank his hemlock with perfect composure, speaking about the soul until the words ran out. And the questions he left behind have never stopped echoing. Thank you for listening. Good night and sleep well.